Albert Markovska's head is chaotic as he makes his way across a marsh to make the most unusual speech. He stands near a rock. He says that this piece of marsh is saved, and that this is just the beginning. They mustn't stop fighting and save the entire place. He even wrote a poem to celebrate their first achievement. So, he reads it out loud, a poem about how Rock has the most exemplary of lives. Once he's done, we see that his audience is quite small but passionate. Eventually, he tells a man from the local papers that he has an appointment to check out some African guys. After what seems like an infinity of walking through a maze of corridors, he enters an office and waits for his turn. In the next scene, he is sitting in front of a woman named Vivian. Soon, after a brief silence and intense eye contact, Albert expresses his troubles. He cannot quite understand what these people do, and the woman starts explaining her line of work in more detail. It seems like she is a detective, but not in a conservative sense. She resolves her clients' cases by spying on them throughout their everyday activities. Albert isn't happy about that at all. He understands that if he gets involved with her, his privacy will be completely destroyed. But he is in a terrible situation, in a crisis, and Vivian is an expert in resolving people's existential problems. She also mentions her associate, who will approach his situation from a different angle. In short, Albert is facing a huge existential crisis, and Vivian, with the help of her associate and active spying, will help him resolve it. Albert is totally lost. It all sounds like something taken out of a fictional piece. Then we learn how Albert found them. He was meeting someone in a fancy restaurant, but didn't have proper clothing, so he borrowed a suit jacket in which he found their card. And it isn't the only coincidence that keeps Albert awake at night. There is another one, the one that's much more meaningful to him, and it involves one African man, whom he met 3 times. The first time he was at a photo archive, getting stills of Bob Dylan. 2 weeks later he saw the same African man working as a doorman in a building where his friend resides. And the third time, he was in a van in the parking lot of a mall. Albert was working there, planting trees in the middle of the lot, making a statement for open spaces. That's what he does for a living. He is a director of the Open Space Coalition. Albert is sure that these coincidences must provide him with some insight into what to do with his life and how the universe in general is operating. Because quite frankly, he is lost. It is obvious to Vivian that Albert wants to find out the ultimate truth about reality, but she warns him first. This procedure will alter his whole perception of life. But Albert doesn't want to back down. Additionally, he asks Vivian to stay out of his work. Vivian doesn't say anything about that. Instead, she leads him through another door and introduces him to her associate and husband, Bernard Jeff. This man seems to be quite weird. He takes out a sleeping bag, and even though Vivian asks him to approach Albert slowly, he clearly has no intention to do so. Once Vivian leaves, he takes out a blanket and holds it in front of Albert. He asks Albert to imagine that this blanket is everything, the whole universe. Everything is the same, even if it is different. Everything is connected. Bernard then goes on by saying that we must learn to see this truth all the time. Because when you get the blanket truth, you can relax, you can understand that everything that you desire and lack is there within your grasp. And that's why he took out the sleeping bag earlier. Albert will get in there regularly and get separated from his everyday perceptions and his identity, which makes Albert think he's separate from everything. It sounds wonderful, but once Albert gets in there, chaos breaks out in his brain. He thinks of people in his life and the meeting in that fancy restaurant. It seems like he met someone named Brad Stand, the sales executive from a company called Huckabees. Over the table, they discuss how their collaboration will be beneficial for both. It seems like it is a hurtful memory for Albert, since to stop thinking about it, he has to cut the image of Brad with a machete. Then comes the image of Jessica Lange, then of a model and a woman, all hostile towards him. He cuts them all with a machete and comes out of the sleeping bag, sweating and gasping for air. Bernard calms him down. With more practice at home, eventually, Albert will master it. The next morning, when doing his normal routine, Albert notices Vivian watching him from the window. Then he goes to work. Standing at the Huckabees parking lot, Vivian watches as Albert gets constantly abused. Then Albert goes to his small office and meets his subordinates. We learn that there was supposed to be a meeting here, that Brad took to Huckabees' office. Albert is infuriated. He knows that Brad is trying to steal his coalition. Then a woman named Angela walks in and starts shouting at him. She wants his poems out of the parking lot. She is also a member of Albert's coalition, but it is obvious that she is on Brad's side. In the next scene, Vivian pelts him with questions about his work, but this has nothing to do with his coincidence. There is no reason for Vivian to be there. The conversation soon grows into an argument, and suddenly Bernard appears in the parking lot and gives Vivian his phone. Once he is left alone with Albert, he reminds him of the blanket truth, but it seems like there is no time for it. Bernard needs to leave, and just before he does, Albert watches in confusion as Vivian jumps into Angela's car. In the next scene, we are introduced to Tommy Korn, another client of Vivian and Bernard. His wife and kids are moving on, and as soon as Bernard gets there, we will understand why. He is completely swallowed by his existential crisis, and he is moving in the completely wrong direction. When Bernard intervenes, he tells him what is happening. He is trying to convince himself and his family that petroleum usage is basically murder, but nothing really matters, and if nothing matters, then why would somebody fight against it? Then he shows Bernard a book written by Katerina Vauban, who says that nothing matters, and it makes much more sense to Tommy. If destruction is embedded in everything around him, including humans, then the whole petroleum thing poses no more questions. Bernard is dumbfounded. The name Vauban clearly means something to him. She is supposed to be in Paris, not in America. She never leaves France. There are only 3 people in Huckabee's parking lot in the next scene. Angela is trailing Vivian, and at the end of this weird train comes another woman, dressed in a white coat. We don't know her yet. There is a meeting going on right now at Huckabee's, the one that was supposed to be held in Albert's office. Vivian listens in the corridor as Brad Stan tells a story of how he made someone change their mind. Brad seems like a charming, charismatic person. Suddenly, Brad's assistant walks out of the meeting room and sees Vivian sitting on the floor, listening. The woman in the white coat is also there, but Darlene doesn't notice her at all. She makes Vivian leave, but not before she observes the whole floor thoroughly. It seems like Huckabee's is a company that owns a chain of stores. The face of this company is a model named Dawn Campbell. She is Brad's girlfriend, and we recognize her from Albert's dream. And as Albert sits on the rock that he saved, writing a poem about being stabbed in the back, there is a heated disagreement in the Huckabee's headquarters. Albert's supporters are arguing with Brad's supporters, while Vivian is listening to them, acting like a mediator. Suddenly, Brad walks in with a newly made banner. There is no poetry on it, and the image that he brings clearly portrays his way of marketing. There is a photo of a model oddly placed in front of the photo of a marsh. This is the kind of thing that catches the attention of the masses, not some silly, lousy poetry. The owner of the marsh likes it very much. Suddenly, he notices somebody in the room that he doesn't recognize, Vivian. He decides to have a little chat with her and introduces himself. Vivian is very open with him. She says that she's with Albert Markovsky and that she's an investigator. Naturally, Brad gets very interested, so he learns everything that Vivian and Bernard do. In the next scene, Albert scolds Vivian for everything. Now his career is in grave danger. Enraged, he shouts at her for not taking his request into account. And to calm him down, Vivian suddenly takes out a photo of the African man and tells him his name. It's Mr. Naimiri. She also got to know Albert's little secret. It seems like Albert wasn't going to the archive to get a photo of Bob Dylan, as he said. He was there to plant his photos in the archive in order to be noticed. This trait of his also explains why he brought Brad into the coalition. But it all sounds ridiculous to Albert. He wants to see his file. Vivian doesn't let him do that, and they continue pelting him with their theories. Finally, if all this wasn't enough, Bernard takes out the sleeping bag and asks Albert to get in it. The hating faces start coming once more. He remembers how Brad told him about Dawn, his girlfriend, and the way she loves Albert's poems. Bernard senses that Brad is all he thinks about, so he urges him to imagine a tree on a field and put someone he respects there. Suddenly, Brad appears on the screen. Albert cannot help but think about him. His charismatic enemy seems to have possessed his mind. Albert jumps out of the sleeping bag, screaming. He had to chop him up with a machete again. He thought he understood the blanket truth, but now he isn't so sure. In the next scene, we see Brad sitting in front of Bernard, reading a poem to him. Albert is enraged when he sees him. Nothing can calm him down, even though Vivian is trying so hard to explain that Brad is there to resolve his own crisis. Now he's their new client. Meanwhile, Brad is sitting there, acting like a sinless lamb, but Albert will not be fooled. He knows what his intentions are. He wants to invade every part of his life and fill it entirely with poison. Suddenly, however, instead of freaking out some more, Albert starts meditating, remembering the blanket truth. Bernard and Vivian are extremely proud of him when he calms down and asks Brad how things are with the coalition. He even says that he looks forward to working with him again. But Brad suddenly leaves his character and says that it isn't going to happen. This is it. No blanket truth will hold Albert's hand now. Today, Oren, the national director of the coalition, is coming to town to review the charter. This is why Brad is here, to unnerve him, so that he makes a joke out of himself at the meeting. They will throw him out of the charter, and Brad will take his place. To upset Albert even more, Brad says that he's probably acting like this because of Dawn. This is the last straw. Albert attempts to leave, but Vivian doesn't let him do that. Suddenly, they have an idea for him. There is a person very much like him among their clients. Maybe it is time for them to finally meet. For a while, they discuss it, and eventually decide to go for it. Vivian leads Albert to another room where a Spanish old lady is talking about something in her native language. It's supposed to be some kind of treat for their clients, but Tommy seems to be scarcely enjoying it. He has questions, and he wants this old lady to provide him with the answers, but apparently he can get none of that. When it is all done, Vivian introduces him to Albert, saying that when you're trying to dismantle your identity, it really helps to have somebody on your side who's going through the same thing. Albert and Tommy are staring at one another, saying nothing. Then, very quietly, Tommy asks him if he drives a car. And when he gets an answer, he understands why they've been put together. They will make great friends. There is a Mancala hour in the next scene. Everybody is there, including Brad and his girlfriend. Tommy and Albert are sitting together, playing and discussing their cases. And here, Albert tells him about his struggles. They are not letting him peek at his files. Tommy understands him. He doesn't like everything they are saying and doing either. He knows about some writer named Vauban, who says the same thing about getting rid of your identity. But what differentiates her from them is that, from Vauban's perspective, nothing is connected. It is all chaos and cruelty, and it makes much more sense. He will help him get to his files. And this is how he does it. Unexpectedly, Brad approaches them, resuming his irritating activities. At some point, Tommy provokes him, and after Brad tries to fight, he stands up and takes his girl. Chaos breaks out, and Albert takes the chance to sneak into Vivian's office, find his files, and learn about the African guy's address. Unfortunately, however, somebody sees him. And when Albert returns to the party, this man exposes him. Vivian and Bernard are terribly disappointed. They start scolding him, but Tommy takes Albert's side. It is his choice, and he will do whatever he wants. Finally, Tommy apologizes to Dawn for grabbing her, and he and Albert leave the place. Together, they cycle to the African guy's address and see him playing basketball in front of his house. The man recognizes Albert too, and after he learns that this isn't the fourth coincidence, he invites both to have dinner with his family. We learn soon that his name is Stephen, and that he is a refugee from Sudan, adopted by this family. The father is an electrician, benefiting from suburban sprawl. The mother is a housewife, dedicated to keeping her children away from all the philosophical and existential questions, and their 2 children are typical teenagers. It isn't surprising that the dinner table soon becomes hostile. Once the father learns about Albert's job, he begins to actively argue against it. There is nothing that Tommy and Albert have in common with this family. In their eyes, Tommy and Albert are senseless idealists and socialists. Albert tries to concentrate on the blanket thing. He gets silent for a second, so they ask Tommy what he does. He says that he's a firefighter, and the whole table explodes in approval. There is a real hero. But Tommy doesn't consider himself a hero because of that at all. And in comes the matter of petroleum, which further deepens the gap between the two fronts. Finally, Albert asks Stephen why he was at the photo archive, and the answer convinces him that the coincidence held no meaning at all. Stephen just goes there because it is a custom in this family, and a hobby that they all share. Then the disagreement between Tommy and the father of the family becomes too heated, so the guests have to leave. They see Vivian and Bernard when they exit the house. The two naturally start explaining to them that Albert shares a great connection with Nimri, and they chase them down as Tommy and Albert start riding their bikes, but suddenly, the investigators are struck by something. It is the woman in a coat, sitting in a car in front of them. And as their clients ride away to get to the meeting at Huckabee's on time, both are immediately convinced that things are much worse than they expected. In the next scene, the national director of the open spaces gives Albert a chance to speak up and even the keel, but most of the people gathered want Brad. For no particular reason, Tommy is there too. And as Albert begins reading another one of his poems to get everybody back on track with their core issues, Brad walks in, and with him comes the chaos. Naturally, Albert gets frustrated, and he messes everything up. He just wants to read the poem, but no one lets him speak up. He seems hopeless and desperate, and since that's what friends are for, Tommy decides to step in, trying to put forward the real issues, like petroleum usage. This is a joke for Brad, and he says something about petroleum that makes Tommy lose his temper. He pushes him to the floor, and this is enough for the national director to eliminate Albert from the charter. And so, even though Albert himself founded this company, he is fired. All his fears come true, and Brad takes his place. Tommy finally decides to go to the other side, and he urges Albert to do so as well. Vivian and Bernard see them then, and so the chase begins. The investigators try to plant a seed of hope in Albert again, but in the end, they do the opposite. And so, Tommy and Albert escape the building. At a traffic light, Vauban stops her car next to Albert's bike, and with her soft French accent and her promise to help him out, she lures Albert into her car. Vauban seems to be an existential investigator too. And here, Albert gets introduced to her ideology. The universal truth was right in front of him all the time. It still is. And that truth is cruelty, manipulation, betrayal, and chaos. This is how the world operates. Soon Tommy joins them too, and Vauban drives towards the building in which Stephen works. She comes out and just goes inside, and all Albert can do is follow. Vauban leaves an envelope for Stephen, and before Albert comes up to her, she goes upstairs. In the next scene, we are introduced to Albert's parents. The latter is sure that Katerine Vauban is already in their apartment, so he asks them to reveal her, but they have no idea what he's talking about. Finally, he walks inside, and after the usual small talk, out of nowhere, Vauban comes out holding a notebook. The parents don't even have time to be surprised. Vauban is acting like a lawyer, asking the dumbfounded father if he recognizes this notebook. Then she turns back to the mother and makes her read the writings out loud. It seems like Albert had this notebook as a diary when he was 9 years old. And as Albert begs to seize this performance, his confused mother reads out a story of how her son found out about his pet cat's loss, and how he ran away that night to get laughed at for crying until one of his friends supported him. The parents have no idea why on earth this strange lady would bring this story up, and Albert looks terribly embarrassed, but Vauban knows exactly what she's doing. And so, she uncovers the primary reason why Albert is lost today. Neither his mother nor his father troubled themselves to do so much as talk to little Albert about that tragedy. They were indifferent and cold, making their child feel like a prisoner in his home. And before Albert's parents can properly express their anger, Stephen Nimmery walks into the apartment. Now Vauban turns to Albert and solves the first part of his puzzle with ease. Nimmery was orphaned by the Civil War, while he was orphaned by indifference. Once Tommy and Albert are left alone in the street, Bernard and Vivian appear in front of them. They didn't know that Nimmery worked in Albert's parents' building. Albert lied to them, so they aren't the ones to blame. Then they attempt to win them back, saying that Katerine will lead them to total doom. She was their apprentice once, as it seems, but decided to deviate. But Vauban's philosophy makes much more sense, so Albert will be following her. In the next scene, the investigators are spying on Brad and Dawn. Brad wrote that the two are fighting over a poem. Soon, Dawn notices the investigators eavesdropping on them, so Vivian and Bernard might as well go inside. There, it is revealed that the two don't have the best relationship. There is very little connection between them, and to be frank, nobody would feel good being with a person like Brad. This man seeks attention everywhere, and uses his charm and jokes as a defense mechanism to get people's respect. When he goes outside for some meetings, the two investigators are left with Dawn. It looks like Dawn needs a good deal of existential advice herself, so she asks them about their line of work. It is obvious, everybody needs existential detectives. Meanwhile, Vauban compels her clients to stop thinking, and offers them the most unusual of methods. And it is working. Tommy and Albert are over the moon. They finally feel they can exist here and now. Life becomes simple in an instant. They are free. This is the answer. Hitting yourself in the face with a ball is all it takes. But Vauban extinguishes their fire. They cannot stay in this state forever. The usual human drama, desire, and suffering will always get back to them. This is the way human life works. This is the cycle of existence, from pure being to suffering and back. But the boys do not want to believe it. At least the ball thing must make the suffering less, but as Vauban says, it doesn't. And to prove it to Albert, she does something unusual. She presses her feet against Albert's private parts, slowly and gently, without Tommy's noticing. One must meditate on desire and human drama. Then she abruptly stands up and takes Albert into the wild, leaving Tommy alone. In the wild, they return to their human passion, and covering themselves in soil and dirt, they join one another in desire. In the next scene, we see how Dawn changes after hiring the detectives. She is dressed completely differently, and Brad doesn't like it one bit. He runs out of the house, calling her ugly and forbidding her to come to the office. But Dawn wants him to understand that this is the only way he can see her true, infinite nature. They clearly have intimacy problems, and intimacy is nothing other than the merging of two infinities. Brad doesn't understand a single word she's saying, and he knows that it's not her words, so he urges her to stop listening to everything Vivian and Bernard say. Another woman is taking Dawn's place at Huckabee's, and it seems like the latter didn't have any intention to stay home at all. She is there, and she is ready to take up her place, but they tell her that she will only serve as a voiceover in this scene. This enraged her. Why can no one see her beauty without a flashy bikini and shiny makeup? She totally loses her temper and continues making a scene all along the hallway. Brad sees her coming at him while having a meeting with the donors of the benefit that he's been planning. Suddenly, Dawn starts pounding on the glass, shouting at him that it was his detectives that led her to the truth that clearly nobody, including him, appreciates. She runs away and bumps into Marty, the marketing director. She screams at him too. She isn't the icon that they've created out of her, but Marty makes it clear to her that the icon is what they need, not her real personality. Dawn has only one emotion towards Huckabee's at this point: hate. When she runs away, Marty sees Brad going after her. He stops him and breaks great news to him. He's incorporate. He was promoted. In the next scene, he enters a room where Dawn is practicing her blanket truth, and he works his magic. First, he admits that he only went to the detectives to get Albert fired, and then he explains to her how his methods are much more productive. He will do a much better job of saving the marsh than Albert did with his poems. Besides, there is no reason for Dawn to be sad. He got promoted. There will be a lot of Bermudas, jet skis, and pina coladas in their lives from now on. And he will be more than happy to have Dawn in Huckabee's, spreading her love. The only thing he wants her to do is exit the building through the back door. She looks hideous. By some miracle, Dawn yields and agrees. Meanwhile, Tommy feels left out and lonely. After work, he sits on the rock, trying to feel like a rock himself, but failing. He has a cruel premonition, and this premonition proves to be true later that day when he walks in on Albert and Vauban. Is this how Vauban wants to teach him about human drama? By standing between two friends. And Albert too. He thought they were friends. He doesn't need any of them. He will jump headfirst into the darkness of loneliness, and no amount of ball-hitting therapy will get him back. The next day, Brad tries to fire the detectives, but Vivian and Bernard make it clear to him that it isn't possible until his case is closed. Their contract clearly states that neither the client nor the detectives can move away until the job is done, and no FBA or lawyer can help Brad get away with it. Then the detectives get to the point. It seems like they've talked to Brad's family and discovered that he has a younger brother who's overweight and always talks about geckos. Now Brad is just amused. He has no idea why they would bring up his brother, but the detectives are sure that there's something there. Just like him, Brad has his own obsession, toothless jokes, one of which he tells over and over again to make people like him. It involves a woman named Shania and a mayo. Brad refuses it, but the detectives have too much evidence to prove their point. Brad has been covering up his real self all his life, and as Vivian and Bernard go on and on about it, he becomes more and more frustrated. Deep down, he knows it is true. How am I not myself? This is the question he asks himself repeatedly as he comes out of his office. His entire made-up personality gets suddenly flushed out. He gets afraid of his real self, the one he's not familiar with at all. Brad has to meet the board of directors that day. In the next scene, surrounded by the most important people in his career, Brad is urged by Marty to tell the Mayo story again. Brad is rocking back and forth at this point. He realizes that this stooge has occupied his whole identity, but Marty doesn't back down until Brad throws up from nervousness. And so, ashamed and completely erased, he is escorted out of the meeting room. Meanwhile, Tommy is at work when the bells start ringing. He has to hurry, but he seems frozen in time. Soon the truck gets loaded, and we see him going towards the fire with his bike. There is terrible traffic, so the truck and the other firemen get stuck while Tommy gets to the address first. The house seems very familiar, but the smoke is everywhere. When Tommy walks into the house, proud of himself, he sees a person beneath a pile of clothes. Lazily, he reaches to see who it is, and is immediately smitten. It's Dawn, looking at him, gasping for air. Tommy stays smitten for a long time, and so does Dawn. In this smoke and fire, they realize what a real connection means. And then, with an immeasurable passion, they kiss each other until they both lose consciousness. In the next scene, they are carried out of the house by ambulance. And we see that there are other people near the house too. Vauban and Albert are hiding beneath the bushes, looking at the burning house with bitter pleasure. Soon Brad arrives too, already wet and desperate. Seeing his house burning, he gets on his knees and cries his heart out. It is a heartbreaking picture. First his job, now his house. Everything he thought he was, got destroyed in a matter of hours. And as Vivian and Bernard try to calm him down, Vauban appears from the bushes, takes a picture of Brad in this state, and hands it to Albert, who's still in hiding. Albert looks at the picture, then he looks at Brad, and catches himself feeling sympathetic towards him. He realizes that it was Brad's mask that he hated so much. But the person behind it has much more in common with Albert than he would have ever guessed. What's even worse is that Brad has to go to the hospital in this condition. With unspoken hatred, he blames this fire on Vivian and Bernard, and leaves to go to the benefit anyway. It was Vauban that caused the fire, of course. Albert is mad at her for doing it now. And suddenly, an understanding comes to him that Vauban and the other detectives must be working together. And even though all three deny it, it is obvious that their overlapping philosophies are coming from one source, from one pain that drove them apart. We don't know whether he's true or not, and the investigators have provided no evidence so far either. Later that day, Brad is stuck in traffic, so he gets out of his car and runs to the hotel where the benefit is held. Albert and Brad arrive at the hotel together, but Brad is unable to see anything around him. Eventually, Vivian and Bernard's clients gather on one floor. Albert is eavesdropping as Brad is turned away from the benefit, and he sees how Dawn and Tommy approach him. Dawn breaks up with him then. She and Tommy a connection that she could never have with Brad. Finally, security comes and makes everybody, including Albert, leave. In the elevator, Brad and Albert decide to express all the ways they would murder one another in their imaginations. The members of the coalition come inside the elevator and explode in rage when they see Brad. We now know what Brad did to save the marsh. He sold the woods, and the construction is already about to begin. When the shouting and fighting end, Brad tries to justify himself. There was no other way, and he saved half the woods. The mall is going to be eco-friendly too. For some reason, Albert decides that it is the perfect time to inform him that he was the one setting his jet skis on fire. Albert didn't intend for the whole house to burn, but the fire spread. He shows Brad a picture of him, the one where he's really grieving his burning house, and says that they are one. He sees himself in this picture, but Brad is in no mood for philosophy. He grapples with him, and the two ladies that are with them in the elevator stick themselves in the corner. They go at each other for a long time, until the elevator opens one more time, and the woman, whose name has been called out so many times, shows herself. It is Shania, and she scolds Brad too. The elevator goes up again and stops where the people from the coalition are. They apologize to Albert, and ask him to come back as director. The elevator gets unusually quiet until finally, Brad says it out loud. The image that he's created for himself is suffocating him. And Albert admits that he was in the same exact state. That is the connection that they share. And he knows that Brad is lost now, so he takes a card out of his pocket and hands it to him. It is the card of Katerine Vauban. In the evening, Albert arrives at the marsh and sees Tommy sitting on the rock. Tommy is still a little resentful towards Albert, but they quickly reconcile. From enduring the disaster of human existence to understanding the notion of interconnection, they are together, and now they have arrived at the last point. And all three of the detectives watch and listen to the clients from afar, finally deciding to finish off both cases, even though cases like these are hardly ever closed.